April 18, 1942, 7:30 in the morning. The gray steel deck of USS Hornet pitches beneath an overcast Pacific sky. Salt spray mists across 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, their olive-drab fuselages crammed so tightly that their wingtips nearly touch the carrier's island superstructure. Each aircraft carries a crew of 5 and enough bombs to shake a city. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle stands on the pitching deck, wind whipping his leather flight jacket. Around him, 80 men prepare for a mission that should be impossible. Medium bombers do not launch from aircraft carriers. The math doesn't work. The runway is too short. The margin for error is measured in feet, not miles. 650 nautical miles east of Japan, the task force has been discovered. A Japanese picket boat spotted them at dawn, 10 hours ahead of schedule, 170 miles farther from land than planned. Doolittle makes the call. They launch now or they turn back. Every engine roars to life. 4 months earlier, the world had changed. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burned. Battleships capsized in Hawaiian waters while black smoke blotted out the morning sun. Over 2,000 Americans died that morning. The Pacific Fleet lay crippled in the shallows. Japan had struck with surgical precision, and the blow had been catastrophic. In the days that followed, the news only darkened. Wake Island fell after a desperate defense. Guam surrendered. Hong Kong collapsed. The Japanese swept through Southeast Asia like a tsunami, overwhelming British, Dutch, and American forces with terrifying speed. Manila fell on January 2, 1942. Singapore, the impregnable fortress of British power in Asia, would surrender on February 15. In the Dutch East Indies, Allied naval forces were shattered at the Battle of the Java Sea. The Philippines were being systematically conquered, with American and Filipino troops driven into the jungles of Bataan. By early 1942, the Japanese Empire controlled an arc of territory stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. Their defensive perimeter seemed unbreakable. Their navy ruled the Western Pacific. Their armies were unstoppable. And America was reeling. The mood in the United States had grown desperate. Newspapers reported defeat after defeat. Radio broadcasts carried grim updates from collapsing fronts. American mothers watched their sons board trains and ships bound for a war that seemed already lost. Morale hung by a thread. The question on everyone's mind was simple and terrible. Could America even fight back? President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what was at stake. The nation needed more than military victories. It needed hope. It needed proof that Japanese cities were not beyond reach. It needed a symbol, something bold, something audacious, something that would show the American people and the world that the United States could strike the enemy's homeland. In January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt quietly asked his military planners, "Can we bomb Tokyo?" The answer should have been no. American forces in the Pacific had been shattered. Carriers were the only capital ships left in significant numbers, and they were desperately needed to defend what remained of Allied holdings. Japan's home islands lay thousands of miles across hostile waters, protected by layered defenses, patrol boats, and the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. No land bases existed within range. No bomber in the American arsenal could reach Tokyo from a safe distance in return. But Captain Francis S. Lowe, a submarine warfare officer on Admiral Ernest J. King's staff, had watched Army bombers practice short takeoffs at Norfolk Naval Station. He had stood on the tarmac and wondered, could a bomber take off from a carrier? The idea reached King, then Chief of Naval Operations. King brought it to Army Air Forces General Henry Hap Arnold. Arnold turned to one of his most experienced and daring officers, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a legendary pilot who had broken speed records, pioneered instrument flying, and earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. Doolittle studied the problem with cold precision. A carrier could launch bombers, but it could never recover them. The aircraft would be too heavy, too fast, and the carrier decks too short. The bombers would have to fly to China after striking Japan, landing on friendly airfields if fuel allowed, or ditching if it didn't. He selected the B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engined medium bomber. It had the range, barely. It could carry a meaningful bomb load, and with modifications, it might just take off from a carrier deck. Doolittle calculated the numbers. The bombers would need to launch 500 nautical miles from Japan to have enough fuel to reach China. They would carry no co-pilot-controlled defensive guns to save weight. Extra fuel tanks would be installed in every available space. Crews would train for short takeoffs until the maneuver became instinct. In early March 1942, at Eglin Field in Florida, Doolittle gathered 24 crews. He told them nothing at first, only that they would train for a mission that was dangerous and voluntary. The training was brutal. Pilots practiced carrier-style takeoffs again and again, lifting B-25s off runways marked to simulate a carrier's flight deck. They learned to pull the yoke hard at precisely 65 miles per hour, to rotate the nose skyward and trust the aircraft would fly. There was no room for hesitation. Hesitation meant the water. By early March, the crews knew enough. Doolittle revealed the target, Tokyo, and other cities across Japan. They would launch from a carrier, strike in broad daylight, and continue west to China. The odds of survival uncertain. The odds of success even less clear. 16 crews volunteered. 80 men who understood they might never come home.
On April 1, 1942, USS Hornet slipped quietly out of San Francisco Bay. Her flight deck carried an unusual cargo. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat lashed to the deck, painted in fresh olive drab, their propellers still. Sailors and airmen stared at the sight. Bombers on a carrier deck were an impossibility made visible. Some of the Navy men shook their heads. Others whispered that it was suicide. Doolittle's crews had boarded in secret, their faces drawn with the weight of what lay ahead. They knew the mission now. They knew the risks. They had spent weeks stripping weight from the bombers, installing extra fuel bladders in crawl spaces and bomb bays, removing every non-essential system. Each aircraft would carry 4 500-pound bombs, 3 high-explosive and 1 incendiary cluster. The targets had been selected with care: factories, oil refineries, power plants, and military installations across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. The plan was precise. The task force would approach Japan from the northeast, threading between Japanese patrol lines. At 500 nautical miles from the coast, approximately 450 statute miles, the bombers would launch at dusk on April 18. They would arrive over Japan at night, strike under cover of darkness, and continue west across the Sea of Japan toward China. Friendly Chinese airfields near the coast would receive them, or so the plan went. On April 13, in the mid-Pacific, Hornet rendezvoused with Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey's Task Force 16, built around the carrier USS Enterprise. Enterprise would provide air cover and combat air patrol, while Hornet's deck remained crowded with bombers. The combined force turned west and accelerated toward Japan at 20 knots, maintaining strict radio silence. The men waited. The tension on Hornet was palpable. Doolittle walked among the crews, calm and steady, checking equipment, reviewing navigation, offering quiet reassurance. He carried no illusions. This mission was a gamble.
The bombers had never been tested under combat conditions launching from a carrier. The fuel calculations were razor thin. The chances of reaching the Chinese airfields were marginal at best. And once over Japan, every aircraft would be vulnerable, slow, unarmored, and loaded with bombs. But the strategic purpose was clear. The raid was not designed to destroy Japan's war machine. 16 bombers carrying 64 bombs could not cripple an empire. The raid was designed to do something more dangerous, to shatter the illusion of Japanese invulnerability. For 4 months, Japan had waged war without consequence. Its cities had never been threatened. Its civilians had never heard air raid sirens. The military leadership had promised the homeland was untouchable. Doolittle and his men were about to prove them wrong. The task force raced across the Pacific undetected. Japanese patrol planes swept the ocean to the east, but the Americans remained beyond their range. The weather deteriorated. Low clouds, rough seas, and intermittent rain provided cover. Halsey's force pressed west, deeper into enemy waters. By the evening of April 17, the task force had crossed into the outer perimeter of Japanese defenses. Patrol boats, small picket vessels equipped with radios, dotted the ocean ahead in a picket line designed to detect incoming threats. The Americans knew the boats were there. The plan accounted for them. If the force could slip past undetected, they would reach the launch point by dusk on April 18. But dawn on April 18 brought trouble. At 7:38 a.m., lookouts on Enterprise spotted a Japanese patrol boat on the horizon, Nito Maru, a small fishing vessel serving as a picket. The task force was still 650 nautical miles from Japan, 170 miles farther than the planned launch point. The boat had seen them. It was transmitting. Halsey ordered the cruiser USS Nashville to open fire. Shells straddled the small vessel, splintering its wooden hull. The boat listed and began to sink, but the damage was done. The radio message had been sent. Japanese forces now knew an American task force was approaching. Doolittle and Halsey conferred on Hornet's Bridge. The options were stark. If they waited until dusk to launch, Japanese bombers and patrol planes would find the task force. The carriers would be attacked, possibly sunk. But if they launched now, immediately, in daylight from 650 miles out, the bombers might not have enough fuel to reach China. Crews would run out of fuel over the ocean or in the mountains of China. Losses would be heavy. Doolittle looked at Halsey. "We'll launch now." The deck exploded into motion. Sailors and airmen swarmed over the bombers, pulling chocks, fueling, making last-minute checks. The mission was no longer theoretical. The countdown had begun. The men who climbed into the B-25s that morning were not hardened veterans. Most were in their 20s. Some had never seen combat. They were pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. Ordinary Americans pulled from bases across the country and thrust into an extraordinary mission. They had trained for this moment, but training could not replicate the reality. Standing on Hornet's heaving deck, engines roaring, salt spray soaking their flight suits, they faced a simple and terrible equation: take off or die trying. The deck was 467 feet long. A B-25 Mitchell needed at least 300 feet to become airborne under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. The carrier pitched in heavy swells. Crosswinds gusted across the deck. A single miscalculation, too slow, too fast, a moment's hesitation, would send 15 tons of bomber and fuel into the ocean. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle climbed into the lead aircraft. He would go first. He would prove it could be done. His crew settled in around him: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, gunner. Men with families, men with futures they might never see. Doolittle's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. He had flown every type of aircraft the Army possessed. He had raced planes, tested experimental designs, and survived crashes that killed other pilots. But this was different. This was not about speed or skill.
This was about will. The deck officer raised the flag. Doolittle pushed the throttles forward. The engine screamed. The bomber rolled forward, slowly at first, then faster. The deck rushed beneath him, 60 miles an hour, 65. The bow of the carrier rose on a swell. Doolittle pulled back the yoke. The bomber lifted, hung for a moment between flight and failure, then climbed into the gray sky. Behind him, 15 more bombers would follow. Each pilot watched the one ahead. Each crew prayed the same prayer. One by one, they roared down the deck, engines howling, wheels lifting, wings biting into the wind. One by one, they cleared the bow and turned west. Every single bomber made it off the deck. 80 men, airborne, aimed at the heart of Japan.
From a tactical standpoint, the Doolittle raid was insanity disguised as strategy. The mission violated nearly every principle of air power. The bombers carried no fighter escort. They had no suppression of enemy air defenses. They flew in daylight over one of the most heavily defended nations on Earth. The plan assumed the bombers could reach Japan undetected, strike their targets, and escape before Japanese fighters could intercept them. It assumed the weather would cooperate. It assumed the modified B-25 Mitchells could carry enough fuel to reach China, a distance of over 2,000 miles from the launch point. It assumed Chinese airfields would be ready to receive them with fuel and support waiting. Every assumption was fragile. The early launch compounded the risk. 665 nautical miles meant the bombers were flying at the absolute edge of their range. Navigators recalculated fuel consumption in real time, measuring every gallon against the miles remaining. Pilots leaned the engines to conserve fuel, running them as efficiently as physics allowed. There would be no second chances, no emergency landings, no rescue. The approach to Japan was conducted at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection. The bomber skimmed the ocean, 50 feet above the water, invisible to Japanese early warning systems. They flew in loose formations, spread across miles of sky, navigating by compass and dead reckoning. For 5 hours they raced west, the coastline of Japan drawing closer with every passing minute. At noon, the first bombers sighted land. The coast of Japan emerged from the haze, green mountains, coastal towns, fishing boats dotting the bays. Doolittle's aircraft climbed to 1,500 feet. Behind him, the other bombers followed, each selecting their targets based on pre-mission briefings. The tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. Each bomber would strike one primary target: factories in Tokyo, shipyards in Yokohama, oil refineries in Nagoya. They would fly straight and level over the target, drop their bombs, and escape at low altitude before Japanese fighters could react. The entire strike would take minutes. Then the race to China would begin. But tactics are only as good as the intelligence behind them. The Americans did not know how quickly Japan's air defenses would respond. They did not know whether fighters were already scrambling. They did not know if anti-aircraft batteries were tracking them. They would find out soon enough. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed for this mission. North American Aviation built the Mitchell as a medium bomber, durable, versatile, and reliable, but optimized for land-based operations. It weighed 13 tons fully loaded. Its wingspan stretched 67 feet. Its twin Wright R2600 engines produced 1,700 horsepower each. On a standard runway, it performed beautifully. On a carrier deck, it was a physics problem waiting to fail. Doolittle and his engineers had spent weeks solving that problem. They stripped unnecessary weight, removed the lower gun turret, pulled out heavy radios, lightened the bomb load. They installed collapsible fuel bladders in every available space, in the bomb bay, in the crawlways, even in the fuselage. Total fuel capacity increased to over 1,100 gallons. Range extended to 2,400 miles, barely enough to reach China if everything went perfectly. The tail section received reinforcement. The bomb shackles were recalibrated to carry a mix of 500-pound bombs, 3 general-purpose high-explosive, and 1 incendiary cluster designed to start fires. The Norden bomb sight, the most classified piece of equipment in the Army Air Forces, was installed and covered with a tarp until mission start. If captured, it would be destroyed. But the most critical modification was invisible: the training. The pilots had learned to treat the carrier deck like a runway only 467 feet long. They had practiced until muscle memory took over. At 65 miles per hour, pull back. Hard. Trust the wings. Trust the engines. Trust the mathematics. The technology worked because the men made it work. The bombers lifted off that morning not because they were designed to, but because 80 men refused to believe it was impossible. Shall I continue to Section 2 of Angles?
James Harold Doolittle was 45 years old when he led the raid on Tokyo. He was old by pilot standards, old by combat standards, and far too valuable to risk on a mission with such slim odds of success. General Hap Arnold had told him as much. Arnold wanted Doolittle to plan the mission, train the crews, and send someone else to lead it. Doolittle refused. A mission this dangerous required a leader willing to go first, to prove the takeoff could be done, to share the risk with the men he commanded. Leadership, in Doolittle's view, was not about rank or safety. It was about standing in front when the bullets started flying. His approach to the mission was meticulous. He calculated fuel margins down to the gallon. He drilled the crews until they could assemble bombs blindfolded. He studied Japanese geography, weather patterns, and air defenses. He planned contingencies for every scenario: early detection, mechanical failure, fighter interception. He knew the odds. He knew most of the crews would not make it back. And yet, he never wavered. On the morning of April 18, when the Japanese picket boat was spotted, Doolittle made the decision in seconds: launch now or turn back. There was no committee, no debate, no time to calculate alternatives. Halsey trusted him, the crews trusted him, Doolittle trusted himself. He climbed into the lead bomber and rolled down the deck first. That single act, leading from the front, defined the mission's moral center. The men who followed him did so not out of orders, but out of respect. They watched him take off, watched him disappear into the western sky, and they followed because he had shown them it could be done. Leadership in war is often measured by outcomes, but in that moment it was measured by presence. Doolittle did not ask his men to do anything he would not do himself, and for that they would have followed him anywhere. For Japan, the raid was unthinkable. Since December 1941, the empire had operated under a doctrine of absolute defensive superiority. The home islands were protected by layered defenses: patrol boats, early warning radar, fighter squadrons stationed at airfields from Hokkaido to Kyushu. The Imperial Navy controlled the Western Pacific. American forces were scattered, defeated, and hundreds of miles away. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, these cities were sanctuaries, untouchable, beyond the reach of any conceivable threat. The military leadership had told the people as much. Air raid drills were conducted, but they were perfunctory, theoretical exercises. No one truly believed American bombers would appear over Tokyo. The idea was absurd. The mathematics didn't work. The distances were too great, the defenses too strong. This overconfidence created a blind spot, one the Doolittle raid exploited with surgical precision. When the bombers appeared over Tokyo shortly after noon on April 18, the reaction was confusion. Air raid sirens wailed, but civilians stood in the streets staring upward. Some thought it was a drill. Others believed the aircraft were Japanese.
The bombers flew low, their American markings clearly visible, but the idea that these planes had come from across the Pacific seemed impossible. Japanese fighters scrambled, but too late. By the time they reached altitude, the bombers had already dropped their payloads and disappeared. Anti-aircraft batteries fired, but the guns were not manned for combat. Tracking was slow. Shells exploded behind the fleeing aircraft. The raid lasted 30 seconds over each target. Bombs fell on the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, on factories in Tokyo's industrial district, on oil storage tanks in Yokohama. Fires ignited, explosions echoed through the streets. Then the bombers were gone, vanishing into the western sky as suddenly as they had appeared. The damage was minimal: 50 dead, 400 wounded, a handful of buildings destroyed. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. The Emperor's palace stood less than a mile from one of the bombing runs. The people had been promised safety. The military had been certain of its defenses. Both promises had been shattered in less than an hour. The final angle of the Doolittle raid was written not in the skies over Japan, but in the mountains and villages of eastern China. The plan had always depended on Chinese assistance. After striking Japan, the bombers would continue west, crossing the Sea of Japan and the Korean Peninsula, then descending toward friendly airfields in Zhejiang province. The Chinese national government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had agreed to support the mission. Airfields would be prepared, fuel would be waiting. But communication broke down. The early launch meant the bombers arrived over China hours ahead of schedule, in darkness, in a rainstorm. Radios failed, navigation became guesswork, fuel gauges dropped toward empty. 15 of the 16 bombers crash-landed or were abandoned over China. Crews bailed out into the night, parachuting into mountains, rice paddies, and forests. One bomber diverted to the Soviet Union and landed near Vladivostok, where the crew was interned. Chinese civilians found the Americans. Villagers who spoke no English guided injured airmen through Japanese-occupied territory. Families shared food they could not spare. Priests and resistance fighters organized rescue networks, moving the survivors toward nationalist-held areas. 73 of the 80 airmen eventually reached safety. 3 died in crashes. 8 were captured by the Japanese. And then came the retribution. The Japanese military, humiliated by the raid and enraged by Chinese assistance, launched the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign, a scorched earth operation designed to punish the provinces that had helped the Americans. Over the following months, Japanese forces swept through the region, destroying entire villages, executing civilians, and employing chemical and biological weapons. Estimates vary, but historians believe as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians died in the reprisal. The price of helping 80 American airmen was paid in blood by 250,000 innocents. At 12:15 p.m. Tokyo time, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, the bombardier in Doolittle's lead aircraft, opened the bomb bay doors. Below, the city of Tokyo stretched in every direction. Factories, warehouses, railways, and residential districts packed together in dense urban sprawl. The day was clear, the visibility perfect. Bramer sighted through the Norden bomb site, tracking the target below. An industrial complex near the waterfront, smokestacks rising into the afternoon sky. Bombs away! 4 500-pound bombs fell free. They tumbled through the air, fins stabilizing, warheads armed. 3 high-explosive bombs detonated in the factory district, tearing through roofs and walls. The 4th, an incendiary cluster, burst above the streets, scattering hundreds of bomblets that ignited on impact. Fire bloomed. Doolittle's bomber dropped to rooftop level and raced east, engines roaring at full throttle. Behind him, the city began to react. Air raid sirens wailed, people poured into the streets, fire trucks scrambled toward the rising smoke, anti-aircraft batteries swiveled toward the sky, but the bombers were already gone. Across Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka, the pattern repeated. Bomber after bomber appeared over military and industrial targets, flying straight and level, dropping their payloads with methodical precision. Factories erupted in flames, oil tanks exploded, warehouses collapsed under the impact of high explosive bombs. The crew of plane number 7, piloted by Lieutenant Ted Lawson, struck the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, a critical shipbuilding facility. Their bombs hit ammunition storage sheds. Secondary explosions ripped through the compound. Black smoke mushroomed into the sky, visible for miles. Plane number 8, piloted by Captain Edward J. York, targeted an aircraft factory in Yokohama. Their bombs cratered runways and destroyed hangars. Japanese fighters were scrambling from the field when the bombs landed. Several aircraft exploded on the ground. Plane number 15, flown by Lieutenant Donald G. Smith, struck a steel mill in Kobe. The 4 bombs shattered blast furnaces and ignited stockpiles of coal and coke. Flames spread through the complex, consuming buildings and equipment. Workers fled the inferno, some burning, some stumbling through smoke too thick to see through. And then came the moment that would haunt the mission for decades. Plane number 16, piloted by Lieutenant William G. Farrow, arrived over Nagoya to find heavy cloud cover obscuring the primary target. Unable to see the designated industrial site, Farrow made a decision. He descended to a lower altitude, searching for a break in the clouds. The bomber broke into clear air over a residential district, streets lined with wooden houses, children playing in alleys, families preparing midday meals. Farrow saw no military targets, but the bombs were armed and the fuel situation was critical. He ordered the bombardier to release on any available target. The bombs fell into the residential streets. Homes exploded. Families died. The line between military necessity and civilian casualty blurred in an instant. This moment, unplanned, desperate, and tragic, would become one of the most debated aspects of the raid. Critics would later argue the mission violated the rules of war, that bombing civilian areas was a war crime. Defenders countered that the crews targeted military and industrial facilities, that the bombs aimed at residential areas were exceptions born of desperation and poor visibility, and that Japan had bombed Chinese cities indiscriminately for years. But in the moment, there was no debate, only fire, smoke, and the roar of engines disappearing into the west. By 1 p.m., the raid was over. All 16 bombers had struck their targets and fled. Japanese fighters arrived too late. Anti-aircraft guns fired into empty sky. The emperor's ministers gathered in emergency sessions, demanding explanations. The Navy scrambled patrol boats and destroyers, searching for the American carriers they knew must be nearby. But the carriers were already 400 miles east, racing away at flank speed, covered by Enterprise's combat air patrol. Halsey had gambled and won. The task force slipped through the Japanese defensive net without a single ship being touched. The bombers, meanwhile, raced toward China. The fuel gauges were dropping. Engines coughed as tanks ran dry. Pilots searched the horizon for landmarks, for the Chinese coast, for any sign of the airfields that were supposed to be waiting. The sky ahead darkened. A storm was rolling in from the east. By 8 p.m., the first bombers reached the Chinese coast. They came in low, fuel nearly exhausted, engines sputtering. The coastline appeared through a curtain of rain. Mountains loomed in the darkness. Navigation became guesswork. The The radio beacons that were supposed to guide them to the airfields were silent. Either the early arrival had caught the Chinese by surprise, or the beacons had never been activated. Doolittle's crew searched for a place to land. The mountains below were invisible, swallowed by the storm. The fuel gauge read 0. The engines were running on fumes and willpower. At 9:20 p.m., Doolittle gave the order, "Bail out." One by one, the crew jumped into the night. Parachutes bloomed in the rain. They fell through clouds, through wind, toward a landscape they could not see. Doolittle landed hard in a rice paddy, knee-deep in mud. He was alone. He was alive. His bomber had crashed somewhere in the mountains. Across eastern China, the scene repeated 15 times. Crews bailed out over mountains, forests, and farmland. Some landed safely. Others were injured, broken bones, lacerations, concussions. Staff Sergeant Lendl Factor, the engineer gunner on plane number 3, died when his parachute failed to open. Corporal Lendl D. Factor became the first American casualty of the raid, his body found the next morning by Chinese villagers. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber, plane number 7, attempted a water landing off the coast. The aircraft struck the surf at high speed, cartwheeling across the waves. Lawson's leg was nearly severed in the impact. His crew pulled him from the wreckage, bleeding and semi-conscious, and dragged him to shore. Chinese fishermen found them and carried Lawson to a missionary hospital, where a Chinese surgeon amputated his mangled leg with crude instruments and no anesthesia. Lawson survived, but his war was over. Plane number 16, piloted by Lieutenant William G. Farrow, ran out of fuel over Japanese-occupied territory. The crew bailed out and landed near the city of Nanchang. Japanese patrols were waiting. Farrow and his crew, co-pilot Lieutenant Robert L. Hite, navigator Lieutenant George Barr, bombardier Corporal Jacob DeShazer, and engineer Sergeant Harold Spatz were captured within hours. Plane number 6, flown by Lieutenant Dean Ian Hallmark, crashed into the sea. Hallmark and his crew swam to shore, exhausted and injured. Japanese soldiers found them on the beach. They were bound, beaten, and transported to Shanghai for interrogation. In total, 8 men were captured by Japanese forces. 3 others, Corporal Lendl Factor, Sergeant William J. Dieter, and Corporal Donald E. Fitzmaurice, died in crashes or bailout accidents. The rest made it out. Chinese civilians guided the Americans through occupied territory, hiding them in farmhouses, leading them along mountain trails, risking execution to help the airmen. Nationalist forces organized rescue operations, sending soldiers and guides into Japanese-controlled areas to retrieve the airmen. Father Wendelin Dunker, a Catholic missionary, sheltered several crew members and arranged their transport to nationalist-held regions. Over the next 2 weeks, 64 of the surviving airmen reached safety. They were flown to Chongqing, then to India, and eventually back to the United States. Doolittle believed the mission had failed. He had lost all 16 bombers. 3 men were dead, 8 were missing. The damage inflicted on Japan seemed negligible compared to the cost. He expected a court-martial. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor. President Roosevelt announced the raid in a press conference on April 21, 1942. When reporters asked where the bombers had launched from, Roosevelt smiled and said, "Shangri-La." The fiction held. Japan spent weeks searching for a secret American base that did not exist. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. American morale surged. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating the raid. Radio broadcasts replayed Roosevelt's announcement. The nation that had endured 4 months of defeat finally had a victory to celebrate. In Japan, the reaction was the opposite. The raid shattered the illusion of invincibility. For 4 months, the Japanese people had been told the home islands were safe. Now bombs had fallen on Tokyo. The emperor had been endangered. The navy had failed to prevent the attack. The army had failed to intercept the bombers. The military leadership demanded answers. Who had allowed this to happen? How had American bombers reached Tokyo undetected? Where had they come from? The failure to protect the homeland was a humiliation that echoed through the highest levels of command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, drew a stark conclusion. The American carriers had struck from the east, beyond the range of Japan's defensive perimeter. If they could do it once, they would do it again. The carriers had to be destroyed. Yamamoto made a fateful decision. He would lure the American carriers into a decisive battle. He would seize Midway Island, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific. The Americans would be forced to defend it, and when they came, the combined fleet would annihilate them. The stage was set for Midway, and the Doolittle raid had set it.
The reckoning came swiftly and without mercy. On October 15, 1942, 6 months after the raid, a military tribunal convened in Shanghai. The 8 captured Doolittle raiders stood before Japanese judges, accused of war crimes. The charges were specific: indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, strafing of non-combatants, and conducting an illegal military operation against the Japanese homeland. The trial was a formality. The verdict had been decided before the first witness testified. All 8 men were found guilty. All 8 were sentenced to death. Lieutenant Dean E. Hallmark, pilot of plane number 6, was 28 years old. He had been beaten repeatedly during interrogation, denied medical care for injuries sustained in the crash, and held in solitary confinement for months. On October 15th, he was taken to a cemetery in Shanghai, forced to kneel, and executed by firing squad. Lieutenant William G. Farrow, pilot of plane number 16, was 24. He had tried to convince his copters that the mission targeted only military facilities, that the bombs that fell on residential areas were accidents caused by cloud cover and navigation errors. His arguments were dismissed. He knelt beside Hallmark and was shot. Sergeant Harold A. Spatz, the engineer gunner on Farrow's crew, was 23. He died beside his pilot, the youngest of the executed men. The remaining 5 prisoners, Lieutenant Robert Height, Lieutenant George Barr, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, Lieutenant Robert Metter, and Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment after intervention by the Japanese government, which feared reprisals. They were transported to a military prison in Nanjing, where they were held in conditions that violated every standard of the Geneva Convention. The cells were unheated in winter and stifling in summer. Food was meager, bowls of thin rice gruel, occasionally supplemented with vegetables. Dysentery swept through the prison. The men lost weight, their bodies withering. Lieutenant Robert Metter contracted beriberi and pneumonia. The Japanese refused medical treatment. Metter died in his cell on December 1, 1943, weighing less than 90 pounds. The other 4 endured. They survived until August 1945, when American forces liberated the prison in the chaotic final days of the war. Height, Barr, DeShazer, and Nielsen emerged from captivity as shadows, barely recognizable, but alive. The fate of the 8 captured raiders shocked the American public. The executions were condemned as war crimes. General Doolittle, who had believed all his men either died in the raids or escaped, was devastated when he learned some had been captured and executed. He carried the guilt for the rest of his life, believing he should have found a way to save them. But the greater tragedy was not written in American casualties. It was written in Chinese blood.
Shall I continue to Section 2 of Aftermath? In the summer of 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army launched Operation Seigo, the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign. The objective was retribution. Chinese civilians in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces had helped the Doolittle raiders. They had hidden injured airmen, guided them through occupied territory, and sheltered them from Japanese patrols. For this, the Japanese military command decided they would pay a price beyond comprehension. The campaign began in May 1942 and continued through September. Japanese forces swept through the provinces, targeting villages, towns, and any location believed to have assisted the Americans. The orders were explicit: destroy the airfields the Americans had tried to reach, eliminate resistance, and punish the local population. What followed was systematic slaughter. Entire villages were burned. Men, women, and children were executed in public squares. Those suspected of helping the Americans were tortured, then killed. The Japanese employed chemical weapons, releasing cholera, plague, and typhoid into water supplies and food stores. Biological warfare agents were deployed deliberately, infecting civilian populations with diseases that spread uncontrollably. Witnesses described scenes of unspeakable horror. In one village, Japanese soldiers lined up dozens of civilians and bayoneted them one by one. In another, houses were set ablaze with families locked inside. Survivors who fled into the countryside were hunted down by patrols. Resistance fighters who tried to protect civilians were overwhelmed and executed. The Chinese nationalist government, already engaged in a brutal war of survival against Japan, could do little to stop the campaign. Chiang Kai-shek's forces were stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, and the regions targeted by Operation Seigo were partially occupied or contested. The massacre continued for months. Historians estimate that as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians died as a direct result of the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign. Some sources place the number higher. The exact toll will never be known. Entire communities were erased. Records were destroyed. The dead were buried in mass graves or left unburied. Father Wendelin Dunker, the Catholic missionary who had helped rescue several Doolittle raiders, later wrote of the aftermath. Like a swarm of locusts, they left behind nothing but destruction and chaos. He described villages reduced to ash, fields poisoned, and wells contaminated. The Japanese military had not simply punished the population, they had sought to obliterate it. For decades, the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign remained largely unknown outside China. Western historians focused on the Doolittle raid itself, the daring carrier launch, the bombing of Tokyo, the dramatic escape. The cost paid by Chinese civilians was a footnote, if mentioned at all. It was not until survivors began speaking publicly in the 1990s and 2000s that the full scale of the atrocity became widely recognized. Chinese historians documented the campaign, gathering testimony from survivors, uncovering mass graves, and compiling records of the villages destroyed. The story emerged slowly, painfully, a reminder that the cost of war is never borne equally. In 2015, a delegation of Chinese survivors traveled to the United States to meet with the families of the Doolittle raiders. The meetings were emotional and difficult. The Chinese delegation did not come to accuse, they came to honor the memory of shared sacrifice. They wanted the families to know what their fathers and grandfathers had meant to the people who had helped them, and they wanted the families to understand what that help had cost. One survivor, an elderly man who had been a child in 1942, described hiding an injured American airman in his family's cellar. Japanese soldiers had come to the village weeks later, demanding to know who had helped the Americans. No one spoke. The soldiers executed 17 villagers in the town square as a lesson. "We do not regret helping," the man said through a translator, "but we want the world to remember what it cost." The strategic consequences of the Doolittle raid extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Admiral Yamamoto, stung by the failure to prevent the attack, accelerated plans for the Midway operation. The decision to strike Midway was driven in part by the need to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and prevent another carrier raid on the home islands. The Battle of Midway, fought in early June 1942, ended in catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 fleet carriers were sunk. Thousands of sailors and pilots died. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. Historians debate how much the Doolittle raid influenced Yamamoto's decision to attack Midway, but the connection is undeniable. The psychological impact of the raid, the shock, the humiliation, the fear, drove Japan to seek a decisive victory that instead became its greatest defeat. The Doolittle raid had done what it was designed to do. It had proven that Japan was vulnerable. It had shattered the illusion of invincibility, and in doing so, it had changed the course of the war.
In the end, the Doolittle raid was not about tonnage or targets. 64 bombs fell on Japan that day. Factories were damaged, fires burned, 50 people died. The material impact was negligible. The Japanese war machine continued unimpeded. Production lines rolled on, ships were built, aircraft took flight. By any conventional measure, the raid was tactically insignificant. But wars are not won by tonnage alone. They are won by will, by the belief that victory is possible, by the conviction that the enemy can be fought, can be reached, can be hurt. For 4 months, the American people had watched their forces retreat across the Pacific. They had read the casualty lists. They had listened to the radio broadcasts announcing defeat after defeat. The question whispered in homes and factories and military bases was simple and terrible. Can we win this? The Doolittle raid answered that question. It said, yes, we can reach them. We can strike back. We are not beaten. And for Japan, the raid whispered something far more dangerous. You are not safe. Your cities can burn. Your defenses can be breached. The war will come home. That realization changed everything. It forced Japan to recall units for homeland defense. It drove Yamamoto to seek a decisive battle at Midway, a battle that shattered the carrier fleet and crippled Japan's offensive capability. It planted doubt in the minds of civilians who had been promised the war would never touch them. The 80 men who flew that mission did not set out to change the course of history. They set out to drop bombs and survive. Most did. Some did not. And in China, 250,000 people paid the price for their courage. History remembers the Doolittle raid as a turning point, but it was not the bombs that turned the tide. It was the idea behind them. The idea that America, bloodied and reeling, would not surrender, would not retreat, would instead climb into bombers, launch from a carrier deck that was too short, and fly into the heart of the enemy's homeland. Because that is what warriors do when their nation calls. They fly into the storm, and they do not look back.